Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, October 3rd, and I feel like a lot of people feel like war is just around the corner somewhere,
Mhm.
either Venezuela, Iran, or a major escalation in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, first of all, are you feeling like that as well? That this is something is going to happen soon, right?
Yeah, well, I think in the case of Venezuela, yeah, it will happen soon. Again, there's never any guarantee, but again, those ships are there for a reason. The F-35s are in Puerto Rico for a reason, and I don't even know why it's taken as long as it has. I think there's clearly an intent to carry out some kind of an attack, and that they will.
Do you think there's a chance that we might have multiple happening at once, like Iran and Venezuela? I mean, hell, maybe all
Yeah.
three, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
right. Yeah, it's certainly possible. There's just no question about it. Again, Iran is. I still don't think it's going to happen soon. I know there's some chatter about it, but if it happens, okay, it's going to be very different from what we've seen in the past. Again, I'm just looking at what the lead up to the war. There was a steady drumbeat. Everybody started talking about a war, and then it happened. Towards the end, it was clear it was imminent. It was going to be within a few days, and then it happened. There was a real effort again to lay the groundwork. Let's say the kind of the social and informational conditioning, the preparation for this war that clearly, took place. This time, I don't see it. There are I've seen some stories, but there's nothing like what we saw before. I'll see some colonel in Israel is making a statement or whatever, but it's nothing like what we saw prior to that. But it's possible, I have to say, it's just simply possible they decided that this time they're not going to prepare for it. They're just going to launch
when you say when you
when I
say
say
prepare for it, public opinion
yeah,
preparation.
exactly. Prepare for it in that way. That's what, that's right. Um, and that it's, for the purpose of achieving, a total surprise, it's just going to come out of the blue, without any of these, um, you know, again, without any of the effort to kind of to justify it ahead of time. That's what we saw beforehand. Again, there's no talk. Remember, it was all about um, Iran's nuclear program. That was the justification. They were just days or weeks or months from a nuclear weapon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it had to, it has to be done. And then the day before, we have the IAEA very conveniently declaring that Iran is in violation. And then bam, it happened. This time, we're just not seeing that at all. We really aren't. There's no effort on the part of the Israelis or the Americans, to claim that, oh, there's a new threat, there's another bomb around the corner. So if they do it, I don't know, maybe they're just going to justify it after the fact. And I don't even know what their justification is going to be. Maybe they just don't need one. I mean, all these things are absurd anyway. But there's always been this effort. It's, again, the West takes the information war very seriously. If only for their own citizens. So again, I can't say that it won't happen, but I just don't see that the absence of, again, the kind of the preparation, the public preparation for this, makes me think it may be still a ways off in the future. But I can see there's the possibility it could happen at any time. I kind of wonder about this recent visit of Netanyahu's. He was there, met with Trump. The deal was declared, or not the deal, but the so-called peace plan. And also Netanyahu, let's not forget, had to apologize to the Emir of Qatar. Had to call him up, and there's a picture taken of it. He's made this apology, and I think clearly he did not want to do it. It was actually very unpopular in Israel, especially among his supporters. They were furious that he apologized, and I think it was not something he wanted to do. I just wonder, like, again, that's what we saw. We saw this call. We saw the peace plan. Um, but it's it's quite possible, like part of like the dealings that went on, there were deals done behind the scenes. I'm sure there were. And to get Netanyahu to do these things, to publicly apologize to the emir, to agree to the peace plan, even though he did actually force some changes on it, which greatly angered the Persian Gulf states and Turkey and Egypt. But to get him to do these, in any case, he did approve the plan, or at least publicly agreed with it. I don't know if we have an official approval, and he did make the call. Perhaps this was done, after Trump agreed, to do something with him in regards to Iran. It's like, okay, I really don't want to do this. This is going to really hurt me, President Trump. But if you can help me, we really have to take out the Iranians. We failed to do it the first time. If you can promise me that, I'll do this for you. You kind of wonder if maybe that's what happened. But we'll just have to see.
Yeah, my theory is that the mainstream media isn't trying to lay the groundwork now because they know they can't really do it, because there was already the idea of going to war with Iran was unpopular the first time. And it was done in such sort of a nefarious way that I think it's difficult to try to convince the public now that we have to do it again. But we have a lot of analysts out there, people like on the Duran, Colonel Douglas McGregor, all the guests on Judge Knapp. A lot of them just feel like this is happening. And in general, the dissident media has been more accurate. And I feel like maybe the plan is that the mainstream media isn't talking about it because the idea is that they'll prepare for the war, move assets into position, and then there's going to be some type of false flag that will allow them immediately in the confusion to point the finger at Iran and begin the strikes and start the war. And then once the war gets going, a lot of times people forget, quickly what really mattered, how did it start, and what actually happened. I think maybe it's not going to work. But I think that might be what they're betting on, is that there'll just be this confusion, and it'll be the same thing like after 9/11. Okay, we got attacked. Let's invade Iraq. Nobody really asked why. It was just like, okay, let's just do this. We got to go back and get them. So what do you think about that theory? Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, well, I mean, the false flag theory would make sense in that regard. Okay, the false flag is your justification, right?
Right, exactly.
You have it, let's go. We got to do it. Look, and you act quickly before people start asking questions. Hey,
Exactly.
Wait a second, there's something fishy about this. And if false flags, they happen. Especially, when it comes to wars, there are many historical examples of false flags, that led countries into war. That's often how wars are kicked off. So that's not a fringe conspiracy theory. That's always a possibility. And yeah, I could see that happening. Maybe there's a false flag, and so they don't need to do any of this other
Right.
stuff. They have their justification, and they want to move quickly right after it again before people start picking it apart.
Right. That's what I feel like is the only way they could pull it off. But I hope that, we'll see what happens if there is a false flag. But I hope that people who are aware will question it immediately. The aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination makes me feel hope that if they do try to pull something off like this, it won't succeed. But if there is a false flag, do you think that someone like Trump would be in on it? That he would have to?
Oh, he could be. Yeah, unfortunately, he could very well be in on it.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's going to happen. But.
Yeah, but again, he clearly tried to limit, it seemed to me anyway, the U.S. involvement in the first war. It was that the strike on the nuclear facilities, great, we obliterated the program, we're the most incredible nation on the earth, and it's over. And, the ceasefire followed shortly. And so and there's also evidence that he really was very nervous about the possibility that the Strait of Hormuz could be blocked by the Iranians. He was starting to tweet about oil prices and that kind of thing. It seems to me, again, I would be surprised if I don't know.
I think you can't look at Trump's history to forecast in the future, though. I don't think we've just seen him switch so much. But what we have seen is that the Trump we have now is a complete neocon Trump. It is the Lindsey Graham, Keith Kellogg Trump is that we have. It seems like that's who is in his camp, and even J.D. Vance is shown to seems to be the moved over into the neocon camp as well. So it seems like this is the ultra neocon Trump now, the most neocon Trump we've ever seen, and I think that's what we should base on.
Yeah, I still wouldn't call him a neocon, but a warmonger. They're two different things. Because again, he tends to justify things not in terms of spreading Western civilization, the way that the neocons spreading democracy, but it's about just raw power, really, and and Zionism. That's clear that he's always been just tightly aligned with the Zionists, so and he doesn't really need to be. I'm splitting hairs, but anyway, we'll just leave it at that. We don't have to go down that road.
He's a product of the people he's around, though, and that he's talking to, and the people he's around are neocons now. So in a sense, he is essentially becoming a neocon. I mean, okay, maybe they changed the language slightly, but it's,
he may not completely subscribe to the ideology, but he'll fight their wars, for his, and he'll frame it in his own way, in his own mind. We could say that. Yeah, well, again, that's the thing about Trump is always, he's always been inconsistent. And if you go back to the campaign, before he was elected, sometimes he would say things that are great. It sounded like he was, again, listening to dissident media and real dissidents. And I think he was on occasion. Let's not forget that video of Jeffrey Sachs that he put up. And he would sometimes talk like he was part of that community. But the thing is, if you were really paying attention, and I think many of us got very hopeful because of that, we'd hear these things and say, hey, wait a second, this is different. This is some, maybe we could get a real change in policy. But then often the next day he would sound like a total warmonger. That was always a part of his makeup. And because of the people that are around him, I think you're right that that other part of his personality has been now directed towards these wars, and he's become an advocate.
Right. So I guess towards the beginning, the start, how I opened this was that we are heading towards war. It seems like that by the end of this year, there's going to be something that has happened. You can't have so many troops deployed all over, everybody on high alert. Either you have to pull them back, but I think the chance of that is very small, because people will be like, what was that all about, Trump? Why did you blow up those speedboats off the coast of Venezuela and rush the whole Navy there? Why did you move all these forces to Al Udeid and empty out these other bases? Like, well, what is the point of this? Why'd you call 800 admirals and generals over? It seems likely that that's where we're headed. Now, the thing is, I think that no matter which war kicks off, whether it's in Venezuela, Iran, Russia, I mean, we can kind of categorize them. Venezuela is bad, Iran very bad, Russia catastrophic if it goes full kinetic with NATO. But I think regardless any of them that happen, I think this will be the end of the U.S. empire. I mean, the empire we already know is crumbling, but I think this will completely whatever happens, even if it is just Venezuela, I think it will shatter the U.S. I mean, just think about the U.S. We're so fractured socially right now. We have no soft power left thanks to our complicity in Israel's genocide. We have no manufacturing. We have 37, I can't even keep up. We might be getting close to $38 trillion of debt. Our government is currently shut down right now, right? That shows you the state of our country. But at the same time, when we have all these problems, it looks like the solution when we have all these problems, the leaders are thinking is maybe we start a war. But I think we're going to find out that when we start a war, it will be the end of the U.S. as we know it, right? Do you believe that? Do you think that's that this will collapse the empire?
Not necessarily. I mean, again, it depends. Occasionally, like in the case again of Iran, that was actually his bombing of those nuclear facilities was popular, especially with his base. It really was. And and I think he understands that, and maybe he's going to attempt to do something similar in Venezuela. Just a quick strike, a decapitation strike, and now, I think the consequences in the end, it's not going to lead to the desired outcome that they're going to be able to install, a government that's pro-U.S. And I think that's very unlikely. It could lead to a period of chaos and a lot of suffering for the Venezuelan people, but I don't think the U.S. will be able to impose its will. We find it's a lot easier to break things, to destroy things, than to build things. The militaries, are obviously much better at the former rather than the latter. As Pete Hegseth would agree, I just thinking of that very stupid speech he gave. But so, he could do something, declare a victory, say that he's made a huge, he's struck a blow against the cartels, and on the behalf of the American people, have been suffering from this scourge of drugs, and then just go home and leave Venezuela in chaos, which is an awful thing to do. And again, it did not benefit us. It certainly does not benefit Venezuela. But unfortunately, probably, what will happen is that people will cheer and then they'll forget about all the suffering in Venezuela and the fact that nothing was achieved. I could see that happening, unfortunately. I unfortunately. And then, well, he pulled something off that was popular in the first war with Iran. Maybe he can do it again, but I think it's going to be that was very risky right there, and perhaps he's banking he could do something similar this time. Well, I think again with the false flag, maybe that'll be, he figures that'll be enough to justify it, and that's a much riskier one. I think that's not going to go well if, in fact, a war breaks out and we become involved in it. Again, there are a lot of things that could go very, very wrong. So that would be very foolish. And that, it could kind of, I don't know that it would end the American empire, but that would be another serious blow against the American empire. It's like, actually it was Garland Nixon that came up with this analogy, the Titanic, and it's got those 4 sections that were sealed off from each other. And it was just, okay, the first one filled up, but then the second one did. And then, it didn't sink all at once. It would be like another section, would fill up and the Titanic would start tilting even more. It would be a real blow.
Yeah, I think Iran has said, though, when this happens, this is when it starts back up. If Israel-U.S. strike, then they're not going to put the gloves on. They're taking the gloves off, right?
Yeah.
They're going to. This is going to be it. I don't think, and I think Trump probably realizes that if they strike Iran again, that this is going all the way. I don't think there's any way that it would just be a repeat of before, right?
Yeah, well, it can't be. I think there's no way that the Israelis can achieve the surprise they did in the first one. And they'll find Iran that's even more unified than before, is actually, much more vigilant. They understand the strike could happen at any time. And they're prepared to take the losses. You had Pezeshkian recently said, I may be killed in the next strike. He was nearly killed in the first one, the first attack. But we prepared for it. We have our contingency plans. Somebody will step in my shoes, and then we have somebody, people lined up for all these positions. We're ready for it. Even, it's quite, really shocking, but I think it's, well, we all know, or most of us, I think, know, Professor Morandi, who is a kind of an unofficial spokesman, English language spokesman for the Iranians. And he himself says that he could become a target, and he's prepared to accept that he might be killed the next time. And you think, how could that happen? Well, of course, what is the IDF been doing in Gaza? They have killed well over 200 journalists. It's actually so common that it doesn't even get reported on, or very, hardly gains any notice. But just the other day, they killed another. It's something that happens regularly. There are very few journalists left in Gaza. So he's not a journalist, but he is kind of, again, an unofficial spokesman, I think, who is probably regarded. It's probably on a kill list that Israel has. So, but they're all of them are ready for it, and they've already had a taste of war. They know what could come, and they know what they need to do. So, I think you're right. It's going to be um, Israel without the advantage of surprise, and Iran, that is obviously prepared this time. Knows what needs to be done, and is receiving support. We don't know exactly how much and how many of these weapons have arrived, but they're getting apparently regular plane loads of weapons from Russia
and China, right?
And China, right? And that's it was even I don't think it was a defense minister, maybe it was a member of their parliament, but somebody who was in the know and like on a defense committee was saying that we've already received or are in the process of receiving a number of important systems from Russia and China.
Right. And who knows when this war is going to kick off, but I feel like everybody thinks it will happen, right? That the 12-day war, well, that was just the beginning. That was just the opening salvo. That this will continue. Right. It won't stop.
Yeah.
So
I think again, it's because it's the, it wasn't ever just about the nuclear program. It was this obsession that Netanyahu and so much of the Israeli government has, is directed against Iran itself. They see Iran as the one, great rival in the region, and in their minds, it just must be destroyed. And they failed to destroy it during that 12-day war. The decapitation strikes and everything else. There are all kinds of things that they were attempting to do, try to foment rebellion. They failed, but they're not going to give up. I don't. It's just a question of. It's a question of when, and it could be it could be this year, but it could be next year. I don't know.
But what's the plan? I mean, obviously the plan the first time with Operation Rising Lion was to enact a regime change. They went after all these officials. I heard recordings that were shared on X where they telephoned all these, generals and political leaders and said that, you have to rebel and follow these steps or else we will kill your family. And so they did everything they could, and it failed. And the end effect was more nationalism, more unity within Iran. They bound together and said, you know what? I know I used to not like you. You were a progressive or I was a conservative, but, we're all in this together now to fight. And we know who the real enemy is. It's Israel and the United States. So if you can't, regime change can't be the goal anymore, right? Like that just won't happen. The possibility and the same idea, I think, in Venezuela, the idea of doing a decapitation strike and funding rebels. This used to work in the US 20, 30 years ago when we were so much more powerful. But the biggest thing is that we had the soft power. So we were able to go in with our NGOs and the CIA and then fund opposition groups and say, Maduro's bad. We want to support this opposition and flood that money. And people are like, I love American movies and American music. Yeah, wouldn't it be so much better to have an American system rather than the system we have here? So you're able to generate that, that dissent and rebellion. But thanks to Gaza, the mask is off. Nobody wants us. We look gross and disgusting. People don't want our system. So I think the idea that we can enact a regime change in Venezuela or in Iran is an absolute pipe dream. There's just we just don't have that soft power to get that rebellion. The only thing you can do is bribe and threaten people, but you can't do that with a whole population, with a whole country. So it's just going to fail. So what's the plan? Is it regime change? Do they not realize that their soft power is gone and they can't enact this?
Well, I think to some extent they don't. They don't realize it. I think they understand that it's been hurt. It's been diminished. But I don't think they still. I still have this arrogance and the sense that, of course, people, again, want our system. And so I wouldn't be surprised. You're right to call it a pipe dream, but I think a lot of these people are deluded. Again, you can just see it both in Europe and in the U.S. and Israel. There's a sense that, we are we have the superior system. We have the superior culture, obviously all these other people are just groaning under the yoke of their barbaric leaders and want to be freed. There was, you mentioned some of the operations that you could say subversive operations that the Israelis carried out. Actually, there was a very interesting story in Haaretz today that it turned out it was very extensive. It went way beyond that, and the groundwork for it was laid way back, like in 2023. They created all these, fake accounts, and they activated it, right before the war began, and included deep fakes and whatever, and it was all in an effort to get the Iranians to rise up against the regime, so-called. But it failed. And the thing is, it failed the first time. It's even less likely to fail the second time. So I don't
even
know.
More likely to fail. The second time.
I'm sorry. Less likely to succeed, more likely to fail. Right. So anyway, right. I don't think they can do it, but that doesn't mean they're not going to try. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
So that is the goal. The goal is a pipe dream, regime change. Because what else is it? You got to go in there and kill everybody. It's like,
right.
I don't understand.
You can create chaos just like for a time, but but the chaos I think will end in I don't know that much about Venezuela, but from what I do understand, there is actually a great deal of support for the government. There are people that hate it. I even know some people like that, very good people. I understand, where they come from. But the majority of people are very strong supporters of the government. That's what I've heard. And I think that's correct. And the same thing I think is true in Iran. Even, and we see in the case of Iran, even those people that were opposed to the Islamic State within Iran, they have now you put that aside, and they see that the greater enemy is not their own government, but it is Israel and the United States. And so even if there is, let's say, just a massive decapitation strike and a massive bombing campaign that does all kinds of damage to infrastructure within Iran, it's not going to, that doesn't mean that you get the government you want. It's the same thing in Venezuela. Actually, when they reconstitute themselves, as they eventually will, if you achieve that, I don't think they will. Probably that reconstituted government is going to be even more, because of their experiences. They know who attacked them, who caused their misery. When they put themselves back together, they'll know who their enemy is.
Right. I don't think that we could be successful in Venezuela. That we would do a decapitation strike, cause a lot of chaos, and be able to claim victory and go home. I think this is too close to home that we will have blowback in some way. We won't get the desired effect in terms of regime change, even if they do kill Maduro. I'm sure that they have contingency plans in place. And the hatred towards America, I think, throughout Latin America is just going to reach a fever pitch. Colonel Douglas McGregor thinks that this could just be like the casus belli for just all of Latin America to just sort of rise up against, the gringos up here, and who knows, maybe that's right. But I think that we will see it backfire horrifically. I don't think that we will be able to walk away the way that we think we can. Do you? Do you really think we could just get away with it?
We might walk away, unfortunately, we could. Again, we can launch these missiles from the ships and, send in the F-35s and do a great deal of damage and then just sail away and fly away. But it's not going to actually help our position within Latin America. Quite the reverse. I don't know that it'll unite Latin America. Well, I think to some extent it will. I don't think you're going to find very little support for it. There are going to be people that support it in different social strata within Latin America. But by and large, it's going to unite Latin America against us.
And what does that mean? Can Latin America do something? Not necessarily militarily, but economically, or just could it affect us significantly? If all of Latin America is like, what? You can't just be bombing, countries like this.
Right. Well, one thing that could happen, I see, is that there might be a lot of countries who start looking at, perhaps again, strengthening their links with Russia and China, just because they see that, okay, maybe one day this will be us. Who knows? That's one possibility. So it could reduce our affect our security within the region. It's just, I think that's one possibility. Again, it's just those countries are in general quite a bit weaker, but there are consequences, like we've seen. There can be economic consequences. Brazil is not a minor player. You were talking about the other day about how, the
soybeans,
soybeans, right? are now coming from Brazil. And I think in general, it can, just not necessarily, not just tied in those security relationships between Latin American countries on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, but also economic relations, to the exclusion of the U.S., seeing that the U.S. is again, a hostile power and unreliable. And it doesn't mean that I think they're going to cut off. That's not possible. The U.S. is still too important to them, in terms of economics, but they're going to diversify away. I think that's a real possibility. So again, that diminishes, maybe not very significantly, but to some extent, it further diminishes American power.
Do you think there's any chance that China could be offering any support to Venezuela? Because I know China has investments there, and this is actually one thing that I think is people need to understand. If anybody thinks that the idea is if the U.S. isn't the global hegemon, that somehow China would take over and start invading countries and bases, it's like China, with the One Belt, One Road initiative, they have just invested so much around the world in building ports and trains and bridges and railroads, just, all this crucial infrastructure. They're not going to blow it up. They want to protect those investments, right? I mean, they want to make sure that we have, the solid relationship. And I think the way that they also do these infrastructure projects is that they don't, like when the U.S. goes to a country and says, we want to develop your oil field, they basically just take it and say in perpetuity, we get a certain amount of profits for this because we built this and invested this and we'll always maintain it. And with China, I think they do a kind of a lease program. Like for 30 years, we get a discount on this resource when you sell it to us for 30 years. But after that, it's all yours. So you maintain your sovereignty of your natural resources. So, yeah, do you think there's a chance that China's going to be stepping up in any way and try to protect Venezuela, help
I
them
don't
out?
know. To be honest, I just don't know. I can only guess. Again, it is essentially the U.S. backyard. It is more difficult for Russia and China to help them militarily. We don't know. There has been military cooperation, I know, between Russia and Venezuela, and I don't know exactly the extent of it. I just really can't answer that question. Maybe we'll find out. There was some speculation that perhaps the Russians had provided them with a lot of drones and taught them how to operate those drones, in which case they could actually perhaps do damage to the fleet. As Yemen showed that it was able to do in the Red Sea. But that hasn't been confirmed. I don't know if that indeed is true.
Okay, well, let me just ask the question that sort of towards the beginning. When one of these wars kicks off, I'm talking about U.S. empire collapse. I feel like it's happening. Okay, may not happen. Venezuela may not happen right away. It'll cause more, just another section, like you said, in the Titanic fills up. With Iran, I think it would. With Russia, I think it would. But with that, I feel like we will be heading to that point at some point with Iran. So we are looking at a U.S. empire collapse. I mean, that's a large part what this podcast is about, just talking about sort of the decline of the U.S. empire. But it's happening at a much more rapid pace than I think either of us really initially thought it would, where we're just self-inflicting, these mortal wounds, it seems like, day after day. So when it collapses, I'm not asking you when it will, but it will collapse, and I think probably in the not too distant future. What does that mean for us? Can we come out just as normal citizens, relatively unscathed, or when something like this happens, when we do look at a collapse? I mean, just think about our society, how everything is just so we're not self-sustaining. Back in the old day, you had farms and people had markets. Here, it's like, where do you get your water? I turn on the tap. Well, the water gets shut down. Electricity goes off. The grocery store doesn't have food. What do we do? It's just like, is that a possibility? I mean, like, what do you think could happen when an empire collapses? Well, when the U.S. empire collapses?
Yeah, well, it could take many different forms, and I don't know. It's just that nobody knows. But there is serious polarization, that's in part regionally based. So there is a possibility of a civil war especially if the federal government collapses, that in part is what holds everything together, because we keep on getting these checks from the federal government. But that's all dependent on the almighty dollar. And if the almighty dollar collapses, we may find that the federal government no longer has that, let's say, centripetal force. It's not able to pull all the different states together. And when that happens, they may, we may see this polarization, which is mainly online now. It could actually, when people find themselves in competition for resources and are threatened with hunger and so on. And there are a lot of guns in this country. Again, we may see real violence break out, and in an organized fashion between different regions. In other words, a civil war. That's a possibility. And then who knows where that can go? Civil wars can be very, very devastating.
Do you think that when stuff starts to really collapse, that there will be this scarcity of resources in the United States? I mean, that's just so terrifying to think about.
Right. Well, it's. Again, actually, the U.S. is pretty well positioned. It's not dependent in general, on foreign countries. Well, it is for its manufacturing right now to a great extent. But when you talk about natural resources, we are rich in natural resources. And that way, we're kind of similar to Russia. So even if there's, let's say, a breakdown in the international trading system, we could survive. We could feed ourselves. But it just that assumes that our institutions, and our markets will prove to be resilient. And
who
knows? That's the question.
Right.
Is like, when things start to unravel, maybe the whole thing will unravel. At this point, you don't see it, but who knows? Who knows if we go down that path, like towards civil war, people begin to be afraid. And let's say, okay, one region has certain resources and they don't want to share it with the other regions, and they actually impose some sort of, blockade on the borders, and then that, who knows what that could lead to? I think the science fiction novel, writes itself. There are all sorts of possibility.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's a way that we can come out unscathed in this collapse? That
there is, theoretically at least. It's just, again, we are a very prosperous country. We're maybe not as prosperous as we think sometimes, and we do, we have this enormous debt and so on. But even if, let's say the dollar collapses and and we're no longer actually able to, let's say, purchase so many of those goods that we're used to purchasing from China, well, we can at least feed ourselves. And we actually, I'm sure that manufacturing could revive if we were sensible and said, it was understood, okay, wait a second, we're in real trouble. We have to start rebuilding. It would take years, but it could be done, and we wouldn't starve in the meantime. So theoretically, it could happen, and we could do all right. We could, but again, it's just the quality of our leadership is what concerns me. We don't have far-sighted people in charge, and unfortunately, so it could be something like what Russia experienced in the 1990s. Again, their system collapsed, and nothing really replaced it until really Putin took power. It was, and a lot of it was, the poor leadership that they had, and they had a rule of oligarchs and a drunkard, and and people suffered terribly. The life expectancy in Russia dropped dramatically, especially among men, and it became, like a third world country for a while. So that's something that could happen. Again, it's like, it doesn't need to happen. It really doesn't. We could take the shock and actually reorient, rebuild, and then actually come out of it stronger. If we just accept the fact, okay, yeah, we made mistakes. We went down the road of empire was, that led to a dead end. let's become a republic again, and let's focus on the things that really matter, and try to improve the livelihoods of our own people. And we, again, we do have the resources. We both the human resources and the natural resources to rebuild, but that assumes that you're going to have rational people in charge, and I just don't see them right now.
So you don't expect. I mean, and it's a nice theory, but
Yeah.
you don't see it actually
Right.
happening.
So you can hope against hope. Just that somehow certain people will arise at the time. It's not impossible, but I'm just amazed. Like just the last night, I was watching those speeches that Trump and Hegseth gave, and it just say, how did we come to this? And let's not forget that just a few months ago, we were shaking our heads over the previous administration and Biden. How did we come to this? This is who we are now. And these are the people that rule over us. So, yeah, I don't put any faith in these people to guide us through tumultuous times.
So, and then do you think that the best sort of historical example of what maybe we should expect? Because what you're saying then is that, yes, the empire is falling apart. It'll likely be accelerated by any action in Venezuela, and even more so if there's if there's a war that breaks out with Iran, and then with Russia, it's just going to be definitely over. And then that case, you might have to worry about the end of the world if that happens. So this is happening, this collapse, and likely probably within the next couple of years, I would say, right? I mean, the thing is what's different about the time we're living in is because thanks to the technology we have and the internet and the types of weapons that we have, history just happens faster. The Roman Empire, collapsed over 200 years, right? It took a while, and then Soviet Union, it was, I don't know how long, it was kind of chugging along before it collapsed. But the rebuilding process, I think, is also faster. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, we had the Dark Ages, the medieval times, right? And that lasted a long time. Here in Russia, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then it takes like 20 years before Putin starts coming and rebuilding.
Well,
and
10
just
years.
10 years, okay, so
right.
10 years or so, and then but with the collapse here, maybe the thing that we could be hopeful for is that, yes, there will be a shock, but our ability to rebuild, thanks to infrastructure, online, digital infrastructure, and just technology, that we could rebuild much more quickly, that we could, establish a new, currency that's digital, that's backed by gold or Bitcoin or whatever it is, or, there's this ability, I think, to create at a much more rapid pace. So, do you think that's something we could hope for? A good theory that
yeah, well,
we
again,
will collapse and we rebuild fast?
Right. Again, theoretically, we could. We really could. You're right. Those technologies are out there and whatever, and they should help us to rebuild quickly. But it does, assumes a certain amount of rationality at the top. And it assumes that there are some strong institutions, market institutions and government institutions that will, maintain a certain order and make all these investments and this rebuilding possible. But I think that's just a dangerous assumption at this point. Or it's, not a very, not very likely. That's all I can say, just looking at the current state of things.
Do you think that it would be much more difficult for the United States to make a recovery than a country like Russia did after the collapse of the Soviet Union, just based on just the demographic makeup of our country? I mean, we play up identity politics so much in the United States. It just, I feel like it might be hard to get some type of unifying message across. It just doesn't seem to, I don't know how, we used to always say diversity is our strength, but it's just like now everybody's just out for themselves and might just be cared about their own interest group. And, that's what we see. Like APAC is a perfect example of it.
It's like, right. Well, that's, I guess that's true. I mean, there are regional divisions, ethnic divisions, racial divisions, and ideological divisions that are really being heightened, and the latter is, we'll have to say, by our current president and the previous president, they were not unifying presidents. Again, I was listening to the speech that he gave to the generals and admirals, and it sounded like a campaign speech. And he, again, he kept on bad-mouthing Biden. You just, what's the point of doing that in front of all these generals? And, I fine to do it in a campaign speech. And yeah, I'm all in favor of bad-mouthing Biden. But, this is not, there's a place for it. And there's also situations where it is entirely inappropriate. And it was inappropriate then. It was a very political kind of speech, that identified the enemy, and the enemy is the left. And, and that's the enemy within. And we're going to be using our army against this enemy within. This is, again, with Trump, he's such a fool in so many ways, and he often doesn't follow through on things. So it's, I'm not afraid that there's going to be really a coordinated attack on the left throughout the cities. Maybe it will happen. But anyway, just using that rhetoric, it sends us down that road, towards increased conflict. There are all these divisions within our society, and what Trump does, I think it's probably unintentional. He's just not thinking through things. Like he doesn't really think through anything, as far as I can tell. But it's inflaming these divisions, and you're also trying to pull the military into it. That's just very, very, very dangerous.
It's just strange to me that we have these conversations where we're talking about just like the possibility of civil war in the United States and just sort of this empire collapse and the fallout and the divisions. But I just feel like 99% of Americans are not in that mindset. And it makes me think that maybe, are we crazy? Are we just are we like doomsayers? Just,
Well, I don't know that we're really that far out of the mainstream when it comes to that. I know polls have been showing that an increasing percentage of the population thinks that we will have a civil war, at some time in the not so distant future, where it was before, it was just completely unthinkable. It is something that has become thinkable, just like, a war, a World War III, a war between NATO and Russia has become thinkable in Europe. Before it was unthinkable. And that's the first step often towards actually the realization, the actual war, whether the Civil War here or, a world war in Europe. At first it becomes thinkable, and then it's actualized.
I mean, it just, if we think it might actually happen, it's just like, I almost feel like, should I take my family and move somewhere else?
I don't have an answer there. I really don't.
Yeah. It's just so crazy to think about, but it just feels like things are falling apart at a faster and faster rate. And I don't want to just be sitting here talking about the collapse, and then I'm like, oh, the flames are here. I should have done something. You know what I mean? Okay, well, let me pivot over to some other stuff. I actually have a video clip I want to share with you. It's from Tucker Carlson. And yeah, I'll just play it first, and then we'll talk about it.
Well, we put up with the attack on the USS Liberty that everyone's so afraid to talk about, clearly targeted on purpose by a country we're supporting, Israel, and it's somehow shameful to say that? Why? Why is it shameful to say that? Who knows why it's shameful to say that, but it shouldn't be. And until we have some self-respect, not anger or hate, but just dignity, it will continue. In June, for example, during the 12-day war, such as it was with Iran, during that short conflict, there are a bunch of Israeli Defense Force officers in the Pentagon that week. And during that week, ask anyone who works at the Pentagon, they enraged American Pentagon staff by just barging into meetings, giving orders, making demands, and nobody did anything about it. How can a foreign military officer barge into military headquarters, even if invited, but barge into a meeting and start demanding, we want this, we want that, you need to get on this? The more you allow that kind of deeply unhealthy behavior, the more you're going to get.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I when I saw that video, it reminded me of something that I heard on Judge Knapp like over a year ago with Lieutenant Karen Kukowski. She told a story where she was working at the Pentagon, and these Israeli military officials just barged in, wouldn't go through security. They just act like they own the place. And here Tucker is saying the same thing during this 12-day war, that Israeli military officials in the Pentagon were trying to like running the show. Like, this is our army, this is our war, telling people what to do, barging around. Like, that's insane, right? The idea that a foreign country is able to do that. I'm just thinking, how do people in the United States military, there has to be some real dissent growing, right? There has to be people that are saying like, wait, why are we getting ready for this war with Iran? Why are these Israelis, these foreign government officials in here telling my boss what to do? You know, telling everybody what needs to be done here. Like, surely there has to be some type of civil war within the military at this point, right? If this is true.
Yeah, no, it's what can I say? It's just I'm sure there is resentment, and there probably always has been, like ever since the USS Liberty. But the thing is, look, that was nearly 60 years ago, and here we are. You know, things are even worse. But at some point, I think there has to be a real backlash. There just has to be. It's amazing that it's gone as far as it has, but we're seeing a sign of it. And actually, you know, just Tucker Carlson is evidence of that. Again, he's not a minor figure in the media landscape. He's a major figure with a very large following. And yeah, that he can say that. You know, actually, we couldn't say that for the longest time, where it was pretty much, you know, forbidden to speak about the USS Liberty. But now people are talking about it. You know, again, it hasn't made it to the legacy media, but I think you can't hide it anymore. And that anger has to be growing. And these, you know, the Israelis have just become increasingly, again, just completely arrogant and reckless in their behavior. You know, with just to the extent that, yeah, you know, they're making enemies. I think there's no question about it within the U.S. You know, again, we see it in the polls, but this is, but this is within the military class. You know, let's hope that it goes, you know, continues, you know, that they actually demonstrate a certain amount of self-respect, just as Tucker Carlson was saying. You know, you don't have to hate them, but yeah, show some self-respect. You know, really, you know, we're our own country.
Right,
you
come into my house and tell me what I have to do.
Right,
Get
exactly.
the hell out of here, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That's just a very normal response. That's not a hateful response. That's a healthy response. You know, that's what you expect of really any country. And then our failure to have that response is an indication that there's some kind of sickness in this country. And, you know, that has to be overcome. I believe it will be at some point. And I just, you know, I hope it takes kind of the reasonable form that I think was demonstrated by Tucker Carlson there. Yeah, but there's a chance that it will take an ugly form. But it's going to happen one way or the other. I think it just cannot not happen.
I think it's already happened, and it will surface once this war in Iran kicks off. Because if you're anybody that's into the military and you see this video, and you know people are seeing videos like this. This is just, one example. I think Tucker is one of the loudest voices out there, and God bless him for it. But you see it, and then I'm sure, how could you watch that as being in the military and be like, you know what, that's right. You know, how could you not come to that conclusion? Like, this is messed up. And sure, maybe you're not in a position of power to do anything, but it's got to be getting shared around. You know, people see that like, hey, yeah, this isn't right. Why are we doing this? What is going on? Why are these, this foreign government telling us what to do? They act like they can just use our military. You can expend our lives for their own wars. I just feel like it has to have broken through the consciousness of so many people, because that's the thing is, prior to October 7th, it did not permeate the consciousness of the average American. Now it has. People are aware of it, including the military. So it's like when they try to use our military, a lot of people are going to be like, wait a second, I'm not on board with this. I think we're going to have some real dissent within the ranks. And I think there's got to be just a lot of military officials that are just, they got to be looking at just Trump, and the speeches that Hegseth. I don't think they have respect for Hegseth. It's like, you're just a PR Fox News guy that now is telling us what to do and giving all these speeches saying FAFO. Like, is there any real, people excited to go to war with Venezuela or excited to go to war with Iran? It's just like, I just don't see how we can deploy our military the way we think we can.
Yeah, well, we may be able to, let's say the leadership may continue to get away with, what they're doing for a while, continue to deploy the military in these, in the ways that they have. Yeah, but I think there will be a backlash. One thing, we just have to look for some courageous individuals. In that speech again that Trump gave, he threatened the generals with firing if any of them dared to actually express dislike for Israel. See, if I hear if you say you don't like Israel, if I hear that, I'll fire you on the spot. That's what he said there in that speech, or words to that effect. So, you have people who probably really have become very resentful as Israel. I'm sure, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm sure that some of those generals are. But they need some courage. They have to sacrifice their careers, perhaps. But somebody needs to do that. We need more courageous individuals. We can't have a bunch of cowards.
Yeah, but then if you do say something, I mean, you can hopefully start a little rebellion, I guess, is what you would hope. But I mean, otherwise you just get fired and then you lose your position of power, and then you get an IDF soldier that's now the general of the U.S. Army. That's what seems like what we do.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, well, hopefully it won't be just one brave individual. But even you have many generals just come out and, openly denounce. It's something that the mainstream media won't be able to cover up, that it will be a major challenge to the current regime,
Yeah. I just feel like the cat's out of the bag, and the more that Israel's trying to put it back in the bag, people are saying, hey, what are you doing trying to put that cat back in the bag?
Yeah.
I mean, just so many things are coming out, just like Netanyahu just openly talking about, buying TikTok. And now we got to talk to Elon Musk and Control X. And already TikTok is, you can't, it's just being censored heavily now. It's like, okay, great. But it's just so open, that control. Right. It's just, and then the news about they're paying $7,000 per post for pro-Israeli posts on influencers. It's just, they're flooding. It's like, we know what's going on now. It's insane. So the jig is up, and it's just like I'm antsy. I know where this is going, so I'm just like, let's just get it over with. I know what's happening. It's just you're gonna bomb Iran. We know you got blackmail on Trump. We know you're gonna you got him by the balls, and that our government is completely controlled by Zionists. The AIPAC. I really think that's what that the Israelis they work so hard through AIPAC, putting all those people in power, that they just feel like it's their right. We work so hard doing this. You don't know how much time and investment and all this that we put in to build this system, so that we have the right to use your military. We have the right to use the government. I think that's really the mentality, and that's why they're so open about it.
Right. There's clearly a sense of entitlement, and it's a product of, again, of 60 years roughly of control, and yes. Yeah, they just come to expect it, and they come to expect it because, again, there's been so little resistance on the part of of the U.S. government and of the U.S. in general. So now they're actually quite surprised when they're actually getting a little bit of pushback, and I think maybe enraged. Again, we have all those stories about Charlie Kirk. They were really angry at him for allowing Dave Smith on the program. They were shouting at him, and and so the response, we see this, especially this new Israel, is not very subtle. It's just about, okay, we just need to buy up more media companies. We maybe, I'm not making any direct claims here, but maybe assassinate more people or whatever. That seems to be the Israeli response to every problem now.
Right. Really. Yeah. No, it's insane. Okay, let me ask you a few more questions. I want to touch really quickly. I'm not sure what happened here. Was there a Russian tanker that was from the Shadow Fleet that was taken control of by Estonia or France
by the French?
French? Okay.
Yeah, right. It wasn't a Russian tanker. I think it was it was under the flag of Benin. Which
the
is not
Boracay,
unusual.
I think, was the name of the ship.
Okay, and it had left St. Petersburg, and it was on its way to India. As and of course, part of the so-called shadow fleet, which is really kind of a ridiculous term. We're not using your insurance companies. We're using, something outside of the Western system. But again, it just shows this, I think, this sense of Western supremacy. If you're not, part of our system, then you're in the shadows. So it was seized. And then Macron Macron himself didn't say that he was looking for drones. This accusation had been made that these drone sightings, over the airport in Copenhagen and some other places, that maybe those drones, if in fact they existed, were launched from Russian tankers. But the media reported, they said, they're going to be looking for drones on the ship. Okay, again, the French government did not make that accusation directly, but it seems like they leaked it, that was their intention. And at the same time, it's interesting that Macron said that this is something that they need to do, start detaining more, tankers that are carrying Russian oil as a way to disrupt, Russia's export of oil. They say hang on to it for a few weeks or something, and then we can release it. But in the event, it was released after, I think, about a day. I hear that it's actually on its way again. So maybe Macron was intending to hang on to it for a lot longer, but perhaps he got a call, or maybe he heard something from the Russians that made him think twice, or maybe he heard something from some other European governments that made him think twice about doing this, that this was not a bright idea. So this went. It's quite it's hard to believe really what's happening in Europe, all this hysteria about the drones. The Danes are, I think their government there is encouraging the Danes to actually prepare for war, to get stock survival goods in their homes. And that's
3
something
days
they're
worth,
doing.
according to...
Yeah, and the French too. There was actually I just saw this little report. A French woman said, the government had told her to get this, and she was buying this, and she seemed to be really scared. So, it's really bizarre. It reminds me of actually the Russiagate days. There was this hysteria that went on in this country. You kind of forget about it, but it was a real hysteria, and it lasted for roughly 3 years. And it was always Russia this, Russia that. They went from one kind of accusation to another, and nothing. There was never anything behind any of them, really. So they just kept on going from one to another, and this hysteria just persisted for nearly 3 years. But we see something similar happening in Europe. I remember actually, like during the Russiagate days, there was seeing these diagrams like published by the HuffPost, showing all these squares and lines, and it was something they had worked out, and Putin was at the top, and he was like, like the head of the octopus, and these tentacles, and it was like some U.S. media and the Republicans or whatever. It was really bizarre. And and then recently I saw something similar actually put out by The Economist, which has a reputation for being very cerebral and rational about a lot of things. But they had a similar, it had a map showing apparent like Russian hybrid attacks. Like, apparently the Russians set fire to an IKEA factory in Finland, and they poisoned somebody here, and they released these drones there, and it's like none of this is real, But they had this elaborate map. It reminded me of a movie that came out, I can't remember, a good 20, 25 years ago, called A Beautiful Mind. It's about the mathematician that went crazy, and then he had schizophrenia, but then he got out of it. But there's a scene when he is in the midst of his madness, that he's covered a wall with this intricate diagram, and you look at it and say, this is nuts. But I find myself, looking at these diagrams that the Europeans and before the Americans were creating, and say, this is nuts. It's like they are in the grips of some kind of madness. So it is worrying, it's just like they just may build themselves up to a point where they actually take action. Maybe the whole thing will just deflate, the whole thing will fall apart, and they'll exit from their madness the way that mathematician did.
I wouldn't count on it.
No, I wouldn't either.
I don't think so. Okay, let me finish off with just something new I want to try. So I went on Polymarket yesterday because I was just thinking like, man, war is coming. And then I told my friend, because I have some friends coming to visit me from Shanghai, and I was saying like, man, I think there's a 50% chance while you're here that we'll go to war with either Venezuela, Iran, or a major escalation in Russia. And he's like, bet on it on Polymarket. So I just took a look, and so I'm going to read you some of the odds, and you just tell me what you think about them.
Okay.
So, all right, Israel to strike Iran by October 31st. Right now, Polymarket has it at a 19% chance. Do you think that's pretty good? Would you take that?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I would take it. That seems reasonable. Like, that seems reasonable. I would probably put it a little bit lower, but not much lower.
Okay.
I might take that.
You might? Okay. Yeah. All right. Israel Hamas, a ceasefire by October 31st. Polymarket has that at 23%. I think there's no chance for ceasefire. Right?
Yeah, I don't think so. It's not impossible, again, just because of the terrible situation that Hamas finds itself in, and the Gazans in general, that they just might take it, even though. But if a ceasefire does indeed happen, I don't.
It's not going to hold. That's true.
Yeah, it's not going to hold. We've seen what's happened in the past.
Right.
But I don't think that's entirely unreasonable. It's just maybe that, again, I know Hamas is considering it. I think they do have some counter proposals, but it's been really presented to them as an ultimatum, so that may not, the counter proposals won't be accepted, and the war will continue. So, yeah, unlikely. 23% is not far from, I think, a reasonable estimate. I'd probably put it a little bit lower.
I find this one kind of interesting because we started off with Israel strikes Iran by October 31st. That's at 19%. But here we have another U.S. military action against Iran before 2026 is also at 19%. In my mind, if Israel strikes Iran by October 31st, then the U.S. is going to be involved too. So I would definitely take that one over Israel strikes Iran, right?
Yeah,
another U.S. military action against Iran.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that gives us a little, 2 or 3 months almost.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Take that one?
Okay. We'll take that one.
Okay. All right. So this one I thought was kind of interesting because it does show that.
Wait a second. By 2026, so by the end of the year.
Before 2026, so in the next
before
3 months.
2026.
At 19%.
Okay. Well, it's 19% that Israel, this was also 19%.
Israel strikes Iran by October 31st was also 19%.
Yeah.
And then another U.S. military action against Iran before 2026. So the Iran one, Israel October 31st,
right.
U.S. till December 31st.
And both are 19%.
Both are 19%.
Yeah. I don't know. That's, there is a chance that there will just be an Israeli strike of some sort. As we've seen that happen. They haven't amounted it to much because they really do need.
Yeah. But if they strike, Iran is going to fire back. Iran is ready to go.
And then the U.S. will be drawn in. Yeah, it's almost certainly. Yeah. So I think, probably more likely, that seems like a better bet. Certainly
that's what another U.S. military action by 2026. Okay, right. Okay, U.S. Venezuela military engagement. Okay, I think this one's interesting. By October 31st, we have it at 22%. By December 31st, 45%. So it's interesting. We were saying where the war is going to start off. The Polymarket is showing that most people also agree that it's going to be Venezuela first.
Right. Yeah, I'm surprised it's that low, October 31st. Now, there is a chance, that, maybe part of the strategy is just to create a lot of pressure before actually going in. Like maybe they're hoping something will happen. I think they are. They put this $50 million bounty on the head of Maduro, and, they are urging people to seize him, to launch a coup. And that would be the best outcome for them. That's the optimal outcome. So it may be that they've decided, hey, we're going to wait and we're going to put up this pressure. We're going to blow up random boats, and we're going to make a lot of noises, and we'll do that for 3 months or something, and then we'll go in. I think that's fairly reasonable. I think it's maybe a little bit too low on both ends. I would put a little bit higher, a higher percentage.
All right. So take those bets, huh? October 31st and December 31st. Okay, this one, Russia-Ukraine ceasefire in 2025, so in the next 3 months. That's only at 11%. But I would definitely bet on the other side, no, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
There's no ceasefire. So just
Right.
bet the house on that, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's probably closer to 1% than 11%.
Okay, all right, so that's a good one then. All right, these ones are more battle line specific. Will Russia capture Kupiansk by October 31st? That stands at 42%. So by the end of the month, it's at 42%.
Yeah, I think that's
about accurate, you think?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it just sometimes sometimes there are collapses, like we saw that in the case of the Kursk, where it really just the forces just completely the Ukrainian forces collapsed and were forced to retreat very quickly. And it could happen in Kupiansk, and it's essentially encircled at this point, I've heard. And I think Russia controls 70% of it. So I think it's probably, at least I would say, a little bit higher than that, like more like 50%, or that Russia will take it entirely. But sometimes you see I guess the thing is, my caveat is that they'll take almost all of it, by the end of this month. But sometimes the Ukrainians will hang on in just one small corner, just really dig in. And, the Russians, we see that happen in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar or whatever. And it'll take, the Russians will have 98% of it, but they'll just hang on to that 2% for another month or so. So there's always a chance that'll happen. So I would say 50%, by the end of this month.
Okay, and
they
then
take the whole thing.
If you're more cautious, then they have by December 31st, by the end of the year, at 71% chance.
Yeah,
so
right.
So
yeah, that's probably pretty good, but I would again put it higher. It's more like 80 or 90%, I think.
Okay, I'll do one last one for you, and then we can call it a day. So, will Russia capture Seversk by October 31st? That's only at 10%. By December 31st, it's at 44%.
That actually seems pretty fair. Because I think they actually have at least have taken a small part of Seversk, but the Ukrainians still control a fair amount of the surrounding area. Now the attack on Seversk, or let's say, really is it basically froze for something like 2 years. I remember in 2022 the Russians were marching towards it and they just stopped, and it's not until this year that they made really made a breakthrough. So anyway, just that, it's just maybe based on that history, and say, okay, they probably still, I've heard that the Ukrainians have a very good commander there, put up an amazing fight for quite a while, a defensive fight. It's obviously coming to an end. I would say it's probably, I would put a little bit higher than they have, 20%, 25% rather than 11%.
10% is what they have it at.
Yeah.
And then December 31st, you think most likely it will have been taken by then, by the end of the year?
Probably a little better than 50% by then. But, you never know. I'll say 50% because there's a chance. Well, one thing that also happens on the line, and we've seen in many cases, is that the Ukrainians, they will, they move forces around, and then they'll decide, oh no, this place is about to fall. And they'll just pull units off the line, up and down the line, and send them there, and they'll stall the Russian advance for a certain number of weeks, in some case months. Eventually it will fall, but they can slow it down. It just shows it's increasingly difficult for them to do that. They did that in Pokrovsk, and I think they even took some of their forces away from Seversk to do that. And they did for a while, slow down the Russian advance in Pokrovsk. Slow it down, but they haven't stopped it. And and it looks like after a number of counterattacks carried out by these forces that they just threw into it to save Pokrovsk, the Russians have really done a lot of damage to those new units that were assigned to Pokrovsk, and they're continuing the advance is picking up. So you just never know. You just never know if they're going to. I guess that's why I would say it's 50-50. If they somehow, for whatever reason, decide that Seversk is a place that it needs to save, they just might throw some things in and slow it down. In the end, they can't save it. The Russians are clamping down on it. The pincers are closing. They will take Seversk, and they probably take it by the end of the year. and quite possibly earlier, even by the end of the month, it's a possibility.
Okay.
But I would go like 25% by the end of the month and 50% at the end of the year.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. This kind of gives you kind of a sort of a global aggregate in a way. I mean, we know it's not fully accurate, but it just kind of tells you what people are thinking on both sides that on these big decisions. That we're not the only ones thinking about this. There's actually a lot of people betting about this and thinking.
Yeah, it's not too far from what I would put on in all these
on most
cases.
of these.
Yeah, most of these anyway. Yeah.
Except for the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire. That's not happening. That's absurd. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can end there. I'm not sure. You might be going on Garland Nixon's show today at 4 p.m. You'll see if that's happening.
Sometimes I don't hear from him. Until later in the day. So far I haven't heard from him. So 50-50.
We'll see.
If you want to bet on it.
Right. Yeah. But, okay. I always mean to. My dad typically goes on Garland Nixon's show at 4 p.m. on Fridays. And I'm Garland, if you listening to this, I'm sorry. I always mean to give a shout out. But check it out. My dad has great conversations with Garland. I always listen to them. They're very interesting, very in depth. So if you want to hear more from my dad, definitely check out his show.
His show. Not just when I'm on, but he is an excellent interviewer. I think he's really one of the best in the business.
Yeah, he is. I enjoy, I always listen to Mark Sloboda when Garland Nixon interviews him too. I think he's great with the Russia stuff. So yeah, check that out. And then also usually we do a members only video on Saturday, but I have my friends from Asia coming over. So I think we'll probably try to postpone that a couple weeks, Dad, until everybody's gone.
Okay.
And then next week, the schedule might be a little bit different depending on how things are going. But we'll try to keep doing the typical Monday, Wednesday, Friday if we can. Okay. Thanks a lot. We'll see. I think it's going to be, I don't know. I think it's going to be an interesting week. I'm going to create a Polymarket account and then see. Okay, Dad. All right. Thanks a bunch. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.